Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me. It's the very first talk in the morning. I guess it's slightly easier to show up for the very first talk in the morning at a virtual conference than it is at an in-person event, but I still appreciate you joining me. I'm going to start this talk with a statement, which is that location matters. And I have that slide in kind of most of my talks, because most of my talks involve location technology in some way. And usually when I'm up on stage at an in-person event, I kind of make an argument about how everyone in the room probably used location technology that morning to get into the room, because usually your conference is at a venue, a hotel or a conference center where we don't quite know where it is, and we get out our maps application to figure out how long it takes to get there, and we get maybe a public transit route so that we can find our way there, or maybe we've called a ride and we just pushed a button, and then somehow location technology magically got a driver to show up for us and take us to where we're going. It doesn't quite work that well for a virtual conference. But literally just this morning, I realized I could track a package I'm eagerly awaiting. I've just bought a new graphics card, which are very hard to get right now. Maybe some of you have been trying to get one too. I managed to buy one. It's not here yet, but I can literally track on a map right now where the van with my graphics card is. So I think there's still a lot of ways in which location technology matters. We might not be going out to things as much as we used to right now, but we have a lot more things coming to us, and that also means location technology matters. And probably, if you've come to this talk, you probably have a use case for user location technology in your applications. So maybe I don't really need to make that argument for you, but I think it's kind of a good way to start this talk. My name is Richard. I'm a developer evangelist for HERE Technologies, and location technology matters even more to me because the company I work for is the world's leading location technology company. Oftentimes, I kind of ask for a show of hands of how many people have heard of us. It's a little difficult right now, so I'm not going to do that. But we've been around for a while, actually, and I have this old picture, which I like to have in my talks, which was the very first product my company ever made. Back then, they were not called HERE Technologies. They were called Navigation Technologies, and this is a vending machine for driving instructions. So this is a device that had the very first digital map of the San Francisco Bay Area in it. And it was designed to be placed in locations like car rental stations or gas stations. And people could use those wonderfully 1980s buttons. And that's kind of the time frame we are talking about here, these kind of buttons, to find their destination that they wanted to go to. And the machine knew where it was, and then it would literally print out instructions for you to follow. I believe there was even a coin-operated version. This was kind of for gas stations. So the idea was at car rental stations, this was a service the car rental station would be offering you for free. But there was even like a coin-operated version where you could put in a quarter and then print out instructions. And you can see in the bottom corner there an example of the printout. So we've been making maps for a while, digital maps for a while, navigation technology for a while. And back then, I believe the way we built the map was we had people just driving through San Francisco with like dictaphones and speaking into the dictaphones at every intersection, describing what they saw. And then that would be turned into a digital map. We've come a long way since then. Here's some data. I don't want to talk too much about the company, but some of the numbers we have here is like we now collect 28 terabytes of map data every day, and we do that we still drive cars around, but the collection mechanism is a little more sophisticated with high definition cameras and LiDAR and all kinds of things. And we have mapped hundreds of thousands of kilometers of roads in high definition for autonomous driving. And I think those numbers are actually couple of months old, so the numbers are probably bigger. If you're interested in that, we have a developer portal at developer.here.com. We've got a lot of location technology and APIs for you to use, but that's not what this talk is about. However, I do want to point out we have, after this at 9:50, we kind of have a meetup where we can follow up on any questions we couldn't ask in this session. I have some bonus slides I could share for things I wanted to talk about I didn't have time for in the 40 minutes I've got here. And if you're interested, then we can also talk about our APIs, which, by the way, includes a really nice Android SDK for maps and location technology. So when we want to get a user's location, like we sort of agree location matters, so we got to get a user's location on Android. So, well, how do we do that? Well, for most people, the answer is we do that through the Play services. There is something called a fused location provider that Google provides. And if you go through the documentation for Android and everything, that's really what Google is pushing very, very hard. They really want you to use that fused location provider. And to be honest, that's a good default choice, right? It gives you it because it's a fairly convenient tool that kind of hides a lot of the complexity of getting location from you, and for the most part does pretty well and does some things for you like managing between different location providers. There's different ways you can get location. You can get it through Wi-Fi or cell towers. You can get it through the GPS on the device. These have different advantages, disadvantages, accuracy, battery usage, and the fused location provider kind of tries to balance that all for you and manage that complexity for you. And if you just kind of want a latitude and a longitude out of the system and you don't care too much about what's going on under the hood, that is a good choice. Now, there are some downsides to this. First, you are now kind of at the mercy of the Google algorithm. Like, they do all of that for you, which means you don't have control over it. And it's not really transparent what's going on under the hood there. Also, you are dependent on the Google Play services. And you may not always have these, right? There's plenty of use cases or scenarios where Google Play services are not available to you. There's countries on the world with literally billions of people among them who simply don't allow the Google Play services. China is a big market where you just don't have access to that, right? Also, there might be customers who don't want to have the Google Play services on their phone. I've worked with vendors for devices for search and rescue, for government, for police, or even defense use cases where they do not allow Google Play services on the phone. So depending on what your use case is, who your customers are, which markets you want to go into, the fused location provider may not even be an option for you. Now, the good news is there are a couple of other options. First of all, Android itself gives you access to that data. So there's the navigation manager in Android. And in fact, Placer, the fused location provider, kind of operates on top of that, and you can just use that yourself. The downside here is it doesn't do all of this automatic managing for you. It does not sort of fuse the multiple sources of location into providers into one location for you. So you have to do a little more work to sort of get to the same result as the fused location provider. But the upside, of course, is you can do that work and you can optimize things for your own use case a little better. Another option is to use third-party providers. There are other location SDKs out there. For example, I've put the Here logo there. We're not the only ones for offering this, of course, but one of our mobile SDKs for Android has its own location manager in there that provides a fused location for you that is independent if the Play service does not need the Play services. We also have just a REST API just for Wi-Fi and cell tower based location. So you could just use that. You could just call a REST API, a nice lightweight way to do this if you don't even need GPS. So there's other options from other providers that kind of do some of those things that the fused location provider does without having to rely on the Play services. And there's even another thing. We will talk a little bit about GNSS, which is the technically correct term for what we usually call a GPS, later on in the talk. But you can go even lower level than the navigation method. You can really, through Android, for a while now, you're able to get raw data from the GPS subsystem on your phone. And you can do your own calculations with that. There's rare use cases that would need to do that, but that option is there. So you can go really far under the hood and grab info directly from the GPS subsystem. So there's a couple of options, and they all sort of have advantages and disadvantages, and it's important to consider those at least. For many people, the fused location provider still is a good choice, but be aware that there are downsides and that you have other options. So the next thing that kind of ends up being pretty important when you talk about location on Android is permissions, right? You can get location unless the user gives you permission. And getting permission can be a bit tricky, especially since Android has been changing how that works and what you can do and how the permission requests are presented to the user at what feels like about every week now. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there have been significant changes for a while now, especially in Android 10, but also again, just now with Android 11, some things have changed. So it's kind of important to look at these. And I want to do three things now. First, I want to kind of look at how do the permissions look like now from a user perspective, kind of how that has evolved recently. I want to look at what these various options that the user is presented with actually mean, both for the user and for you. And then I want to look at how do we adapt to these changes that have happened? How do we make sure our app and our permissions are set up in such a way that Google does not kick us out of the App Store? And that, by the way, is a very real risk. There are deadlines coming up where you may have to make some changes to your application. And if you don't do that, Google may kick you out of the App Store if you're not using location correctly and asking for permissions in the correct way. And we'll look at how you can adapt your applications to that to make sure that doesn't happen. Okay, so these are kind of the in-app little interfaces that users get when you ask them for location permissions. And the one on the very left is that's still the one you might even get the most. Or at least I get those. Like I've got a fairly old Android phone, like a Galaxy 8, which honestly just serves me just fine. And this is sort of how it used to be in the past. You would get this dialogue, and it would ask, can this app access the device's location? And you could basically say deny. And if you did that, we would just deny it once. So the next time a user started the app and you ask for permission again, or just the next time you ask for permission again, that dialog would pop up again. And then the user could also click that don't ask again option and say deny and don't ask again. And then you couldn't get location information anymore. Your request would be permanently denied. And then they could click allow. And that would basically allow your app to use location, to request location whenever you want, however you want, forever. And that was not great from a privacy standpoint, right? And so Google's been thinking about how can we change this? And one of the big things that used to allow you to do is to just even request location in the background. So the user is not using the app, they're not seeing the app, they're using something else. They might not even be aware that your app is running in the background, and you could collect information about their location. And that's not necessarily something, as a user at least, that you would want. As a developer, that was kind of convenient. Once they clicked allow, you could do whatever you wanted. But from a user perspective, that wasn't great. So they started kind of clamping down on that background usage a while ago, I think kind of going back to Oreo. And now in Android 10, the dialog has started to look differently. So now you have something that says allow all the time. And that is kind of still the same as allow use to be, but the wording is a little bit different and makes it more clear that, once you click this, the developers of this app can do whatever. And then they added allow only while the app is in use. And that's kind of a new thing. And we'll look at what exactly that means later. But in essence, it means that the developer of this app can only use location when the user can actually see the app, when they actively have the app open. And then there was a deny button that allows you to deny, and then they've updated this again for Android 11. They've added something which is only this time. And from a user perspective, this is really great, because now if you have an app where you don't entirely trust them, or you don't want them to use your location all the time, but for this moment, the app has a legitimate use case where you do want to give the location to them, you can click only this time. And then the next time you start the app, they'll have to ask for permission again. This kind of inverts the old deny thing, where you could sort of deny once and then they could ask again, to a much more useful, you can allow once and then they have to ask again. And you'll see the while using the app is still there. They made that a little shorter. They changed the wording, but it's kind of the same thing. The deny is still there. And by the way, this deny is now deny and don't ask again. This is not the old deny once. When you click deny, it's deny and don't ask again. So that's not quite as clear anymore. It's kind of implied. And you also notice that the allow all the time option from Android 10 has actually disappeared. The thing though is, and that might make you think, okay, so you can't use background location at all anymore because there's no way for the user to give you permission. However, that's not entirely true. This option still exists, but now with Android 10 and 11, the only way the user can give you permission to allow all the time is through the system settings. And we'll look at that in a minute. So that's how the permissions look like now. And we'll kind of go through these in a little bit more detail really quickly. So while using the app, or the only while using the app, the slightly longer wording, that really is the recommended option. In almost all use cases, you should develop your app so that it works with this setting. And that's also what most users will choose as the option from this menu. And that allows it to retrieve location while the app is actively being used. And primarily that means actively being used means an activity of the app is visible. There is another thing, and you'll see this here, that says a foreground service is running with an ongoing notification. Now when an activity is visible, essentially means that when the user can't see your app, when they're in another app, the app can no longer access location. There is this little trick with the foreground service and a notification that you can use to still use location in the background, as long as a notification is visible. We'll look at that in a minute. Then we have only this time. This essentially works exactly the same way as while using the app. Same thing, you can use background. The only thing is that this permission is only granted for a limited time. So if you're using best practices, you don't really have to change anything. We'll look at this also. And then we have deny. And deny really means if the user clicks this, there's no location information for you ever. This is deny and you're done. Now the user can theoretically go in the system settings and change that back, but I think we all know once the user you've convinced the user to hit deny, you're not getting that chance again. And then there's the allow the time option in the system settings. So you can still ask the user for permission allow all the time, but it has to happen through the system settings. And there's a flow you have to follow. We'll look at that too. And that allows you to still use background services that request location. However, that is fairly restricted. Not only is it kind of inconvenient for the user to allow this, the new policies from Google say you need a valid use case, you need to comply with the location policies, and if you don't do that, they will not allow your app on the store. We'll look at these policies in a minute, what they're looking at before they decide to allow or deny an app that does this on the App Store. And also, it can't be requested via the app in dialog. And I mentioned this; it needs to be done through the system settings, and we'll look at that flow in a second. So now, I forgot another thing. There's another thing that's new in 11, which is that your permissions can get automatically revoked. So even if a user has clicked allow all the time or allow while in use, if they stop using the app for a couple of months, the permissions will be automatically revoked. And that'll be the same as clicking deny in the app settings. Not the same as clicking deny in the dialog. It won't deny location forever. But what'll happen is you'll have to ask for permission again. So you can't rely on a permission you've gotten to be around forever. And we'll look at how to adapt to that too. That's fortunately fairly easy. So first, if we're building an app for while using the app, what do we have to do? Well, we have to ask for the user's permission. So we have to declare either the course location permission in our manifest if we're trying to get something like Wi-Fi or cell tower access. So that sort of gives us a sort of city block style precision, or access to find location if we want more precise location through GPS or also through Bluetooth. And the other thing we need to do now, and that's important, is to account for when a user navigates away from your app. So anytime you realize the user is closing your app, is moving into the background, if your app starts running in the background, you have to make sure you stop asking for location updates. If you don't do that, the app will be considered as using background location, and you might be kicked off the App Store. And that also means that if you have an existing app that uses location, you have to make sure you go through this with a fine-tooth comb and make sure it does not use location when the app is not visible. So you kind of have to analyze your app a little bit. You have to think about, does it use location when it is not visible? And you have to start looking, go through your code and look at where do I actually use location? And there are a couple of things you want to look for in particular. You want to look at background services. That's a big no, right? If any background services uses your location, Google's going to take a hard look at your app and might kick you off the App Store. Job intent service objects, work manager tasks, alarm manager tasks, those are all the kind of slightly dangerous things where if you use location in that, you might get in trouble. And what's really important here is you kind of have to do this before the end of the year, because apps with background usage that don't follow the rules, and we'll look at the rules a little bit later, will be removed. So any app that uses background usage needs to be explicitly approved through that, or it'll be removed. And the original deadline for that was November 3rd, 2020, which is very, very soon. I believe that's gotten extended to the end of the year, but if you haven't done that yet, I would get on that quickly. So here's the thing I mentioned earlier. The good news is if a user moves away from your app and it's no longer in the foreground, there is still a way you can use location. And that is by creating a foreground service and displaying a notification. This kind of works like something like Spotify, where you're playing music, and obviously when you're playing music, you don't want the Spotify app to be open. You want to keep using your other apps. What you have is a notification at the top that shows you that you're playing music, that allows you to stop, fast forward, all those kind of things. And you can do the same thing with a location app. So think of a navigation app that moves into the background because the user is no longer looking at the map, but they still want information about when to turn right. So you can have a little notification at the top that says something like, in 500 meters, turn right, while they're on Twitter. Again, I don't recommend you drive in Twitter or even walk in Twitter, but we all know people do that. So that's a way to do this. So you have to create a foreground service. You have to associate that with a notification. And one thing that people tend to forget is that you have to declare the foreground service in the service section of your manifest and make sure that you declare that foreground service type as location Otherwise, that won't work. And the logic here is pretty clear. Through the notification, a part of your app is still visible. The user is aware that your app is running and is aware that you're using location. So from a user privacy standpoint, that kind of works. So that's the way, if you want to keep using in the background for some reason, is the ideal way to do it. So adapting to only this time and deny is fairly easy. Only this time, again, works the same as while using the app. And if you follow for best practices for when you ask for permission, and you don't assume that once you've gotten a permission, you'll have it forever, you don't really need to make any changes. For the deny, it's kind of the same thing, though I would say that people could be confused, where deny used to be deny once and deny now is deny forever. I'm slightly worried that more users might choose deny. But that's just another reason for you to do the right thing and kind of explain and justify your use of location information in your app before asking for permission. Like, explain to the user why you're asking for permission. Ask for permission when you need it, not right at the beginning when your app starts and all this kind of things, and they'll cut down on people clicking deny and you running into trouble. Now, if for some reason your app absolutely, the use case of your app absolutely needs background location, you are still allowed to do this, but be absolutely sure that you do this. And then you really need this, because why do I keep saying Apple? When Google evaluates your app, they will look at, does your app have a feature that delivers clear value to the user? They will look at, would the users expect that app to access background location? Is that feature important to the primary purpose of the app? And if they can come up with a reason to say you can deliver the same experience without using background services, they will not approve your app. So in order to do this, you have to do a couple of things. First, you have to request foreground location first. So you'll have to request, do what you have to do for while the app is running. You have to do that first. Then you have to clearly explain to the user that the feature uses the feature that uses background location. And then you have to take the user to the system settings. Then the user has to go in the system settings and allow that. So that's a pretty onerous, difficult process. And again, a lot of apps will not necessarily be approved. So be absolutely sure that you need to do this. There's not a lot of apps that have a legitimate reason to do this. And also, when you're using background location, for time reasons, I'm not going to go into these limits too, but background location is limited. You'll probably get background location updates a couple of times an hour. So you can't just burn through a crazy GPS updates, even when you do use access background location. And then lastly, how do we adapt to the revocation of permissions that might happen every couple of months? Well, the good news is this is really sort of the same as one time only, except that one time lasts a couple of months. So if you follow best practices and you handle one time only correctly, you will also handle this correctly. And I really kind of like this feature from a privacy perspective, because I think we all have a whole bunch of apps on our phone that we granted permissions to like months ago and that we stopped using but never uninstalled. And in theory, those can still do whatever they want in the background. We wouldn't want them to do that. So I really like this new practice that if you haven't used something for a couple of months, you probably don't want to give them permission anymore and they get revoked. But follow best practices and you're good here. So I want to now look at kind of a little bit, we do only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to go through some of those things here a little bit more quickly, because I really wanted to focus on those new permissions and changes and how to adapt and practical tips for you to adapt your apps. I like to have this in my presentation because I think a lot of people kind of take this latitude and longitude that they get out of their location, and they just treat it as sort of a number that you put into another API, right? You put that into your Maps API, or maybe you're using a routing, or maybe you're using a geocoding to get a street address from that, and it's just some sort of weird number. You don't quite know what it is. So we're going to quickly take a minute or two to kind of very briefly orient you in terms of what a latitude and longitude actually is, and how by looking at a latitude and longitude, you can sort of figure out where on the globe that is. So this location here, latitude 13.05 something, longitude 80.20 or something. If you just look at that, you probably don't really have an idea where that is. I'll give you a spoiler. That is the location of the hotel where last year's droidCon India was, in Chennai. And if you want to figure out where a latitude and longitude is roughly on the globe, you just got to really think of two things. You got to mentally draw two lines across the globe. You draw a line around the middle of the globe, the equator, and then you draw a line from the North Pole through Greenwich in London to the South Pole, and that's called the prime meridian. And then for latitudes, you just kind of draw parallel lines up and down the globe. And that's where the term parallel actually comes from. If you heard something that is at so-and-so parallel, that's where that comes from. And you kind of go up to 90, plus 90, then you're at the North Pole, and you kind of go down to minus 90, then you're at the South Pole. And similarly, you keep drawing lines going from the North Pole down to the South Pole, going east plus until you're at plus 180 on the other side of the world and minus 180 on the other side of the world. And now if you look at that location at the top again, it kind of starts to make sense, because Chennai is a little bit north of the equator, so you kind of move 13 parallels up, and it's quite a bit east from London, sort of almost halfway around the world, so that's how you get to the plus 80, and you had kind of 80 meridians to the east. And those 90 and 880 numbers, like if you're a developer and you see these, you probably figure out, okay, it's got to do something with angles. And that's really what it is, right? You draw a line from the center of the Earth to where you are, and the angle between this and the line from the center of the Earth to the equator, that's the angle for the latitude. And similarly, you draw a line from the center of the Earth to where you are, and the angle between that and the line from the center to the Earth, the prime meridian, that is the longitude. So if you look at those two numbers now, you can sort of go like, okay, how far north and south am I from the equator, and how far east or west am I from London? And then at least you have a rough idea of where you are kind of on the Earth. Another thing that comes up always is when you're dealing with location, why the heck is it always wrong? I think we've always sort of called like an Uber or something, and it was like, your driver will arrive in 4 minutes. Haha, just kidding, it'll arrive in 2 minutes. Actually, I've changed my mind. He's waiting downstairs. Where are you? And if we've developed something with location on an app, I think we've all had frustrations with, why isn't this more precise, and why isn't it more accurate, to be correct, and why isn't it more consistent? Why does that little blue circle go bigger or smaller? Why does it show me on the other side of the building where I'm on the wrong street, and so on? And for most of those use cases, we're using GPS or GNSS, and that is in ideal condition only accurate to about 5 meters anyway, but you're never really in ideal conditions. Because there are a couple of things that affect GPS accuracy. I don't have the time to talk about this, but this is kind of really cool. This doesn't really cause the inaccuracies, but relativity theory is super important for GPS. And maybe in our meetup in a couple of minutes, I can whip out those slides and talk about how relativity affects GPS, and that would, I think, make your high school physics teacher really happy that you realize that you're using applied relativity theory every time you're calling an Uber. So I'll skip this slide for now. What does affect GPS accuracy is the weather in the ionosphere. So basically, the signal of the satellite, the signal that the satellite sends down to you, the GPS satellite, gets refracted in the ionosphere. And how long that signal takes to travel is an important factor in calculating where you are. And you can see here, if it gets refracted in the ionosphere like this, its travel time increases because it takes a slightly longer path. And the weather in the ionosphere changes, and there are ways to adapt to that and sort of have a weather report for that. But it's really sort of atmospheric effects, like vague stuff like that, will affect on any given day how good your signal is. And then you have things like blocked line of sight. Like GPS just doesn't really work in a building. Like if you're in a building, suddenly that gets really big because you have to rely on Wi-Fi signals. But if you're in something like New York with tall buildings, what might also happen is a so-called multipath error, where a GPS signal reflects off a building. Again, takes a longer path. And also because of the tall buildings, you might see fewer satellites. So in between buildings, GPS accuracy might be a lot lower. This is a really fascinating subject. We can kind of go in for a long time, and I've got some backup slides for that if you want to dive into the whole GPS thing, how GPS works and those inaccuracies. What I'm going to say here is there are tricks you can use, like smoothing this out, like removing outliers, like averaging things, but oftentimes you can't beat physics. You always have to be ready to deal with some inaccuracies. And we can talk about that in the meetup, or you can ask questions about this as well. And my time is up. So the only thing I still want to point out to you is that there are maybe a lot more things you can do with a location that you're used to. There's really cool APIs that go way beyond sort of the standard APIs of maps and routing and geocoding that you may be used to. I'll skip over this before they kind of toss me off the stage, and I want to give you some time to answer questions. But you can ask questions about what is this? You can ask questions about what is this? And we can also, in our meetup later on, talk a little bit more. And I've already got some questions on the screen here, so I'm gonna go and read them out and then answer them. So what is the advantage of using a third-party SDK for locations like the one here provides compared to fused location provider? From Adrian. So the main advantage really is that you don't have to use the fused location provider. And that goes back to, there are many use cases where you can't use the fused location provider. You want your app to be able to be used in Iran. You want your app to be able to be used in Cuba. You want your app to be able to be used by the crazy big market in China. Well, you're not using the fused location provider because it's not available there. Some of those third-party providers might also have their own databases, especially for Wi-Fi and cell tower stuff. So there might be a quality difference, though in my experience, that is usually not a major factor in why you would want to use this. Sometimes it's also a factor of convenience. If you're already using our mobile SDK for its cool maps and some of the advanced API feature it offers, you might as well use the fused location provider, the navigation manager it's called, that here provides, instead of moving over to the Google one, because it's slightly easier and more convenient for you to access everything from one place. But those are kind of the main reasons. So how is your SDK's accuracy influenced by the new access background limitations on Android 11 Plus? So if we're talking about the Here SDK, it's affected in exactly the same ways that I talked about. If you build something with a notification and don't request background access, it works just normally. If your app and you build with it, it uses you do something that uses background limitation, you will have the background access, you will have the problem of not getting updates very often. So you can't rebuild like a navigation experience with those new background services anymore. I want to try that in action at some point and build like a test bed for that. But your best bet is to use notifications. And that's really kind of a message from this, like, don't bother with background services unless you really, really, really have no other choice. And then our SDK works just as well as anything else with the ways I've talked about it, about using foreground. Then we have an anonymous question, says, what about indoor location, i.e. knowing on which floor of a building you are? So that's usually done these days by using Bluetooth. So what you will have to do is you will have to, or there are other ways of doing it with Wi-Fi and so on, but in most cases it's done by Bluetooth, and that means you will have to request the fine location permissions, so not the coarse ones, but the fine ones. And sort of from a privacy perspective, Bluetooth is treated like GPS because it can provide something as precise as you're in this room, you're on this floor of a building. That's considered precise, and so has bigger privacy implications. And so for that, you have to ask for the fine location things. And then we have, for the Google geofencing API, we need to take care of all of these things, permissions handling, work, and the foreground things. So when I use geofencing, I have to say I use the here geofencing API. So the truth is, I don't know the answer exactly. I have an idea, but I think it's a bad idea to give you half knowledge and confidently pretend that I know. So I'm going to take a pass on that question. I'm sorry. Okay, and I think that's all the questions, and I suspect we're also close to out of time. If there are no other questions, I thank you so much for joining this talk. I've teased some things towards the end of the talk. I have some backup slides on how GPS actually works, which I think are really interesting. If you want to know more about our Maps SDK, about all of the additional SDKs, APIs we offer and features we offer on top of the usual stuff. If you have other questions that come to mind later, please join us for our little meetup extra Q&A bonus slide session in 10 minutes. Thank you so much.